Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. I'm Kristen Sargent, Chevy Chase at Home's Member and Volunteer Programs Manager. And as many of you know, Chevy Chase at Home engages adults 55 and over in social and educational programming, both in person and virtually. We also provide volunteer services to older adults who need assistance to remain at home, including rides, tech support, and minor household chores. We are so glad to have you join us this afternoon for this next iteration of our speaker series. Mark Nadel, who is a former Chevy Chase at Home board member and longtime member of the organization, is going to introduce our speaker, Ralph Buglass, and Mark will be moderating today's talk. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we all know about and have seen the various memorials to presidents in the Washington area, in Washington D.C. in particular. But D.C. has a lot of other connections to presidents, of course, because they lived here and roamed around here. And we're really pleased to introduce to you Ralph Buglass, who is a frequent speaker around town on this and other subjects. He speaks frequently about Montgomery County as well as DC. He's a volunteer researcher for Peerless Rockville, which is the nonprofit historic preservation organization for Rockville. He co-authored with them Images of America, Rockville, a pictorial history of the city's 250 years. He also teaches at OLLI, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, the one right here at American University, as well as at Johns Hopkins. He is a local person. He graduated from Winston Churchill High, and then earned a BA in American History from Cornell. In the Small World department, we learned when we met at OLLI some years ago that Ralph actually had been a student in the class I gave on the American presidency, but I promised not to talk. It's going to be all Ralph. So please take it away, Ralph.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Chevy Chase at Home. I was chatting with Mark beforehand that certainly he could give a more scholarly presentation than what I hope that you will be treated to. I hope you feel that it's a treat today. Somewhat in recognition of President's Day next Monday, a week away. And of course, yesterday was Abraham Lincoln's birthday. And there he is, George Washington, peeking on the side there. His birthday is coming up as well. As Mark said, a lot of memorials to presidents, quite naturally, here in our area. These are probably the big three. You would expect, as he said, memorials to the chief executive, the head of our government. What I want to focus on in this talk are some of the lesser known spots where you might find reminders of presidents. So lesser known statues, or various connections to various chief executives. Even for some of the better known memorials, some interesting stories behind them. So for example, the three that I'm showing here, Washington Monument, Jefferson Memorial, and the Lincoln Memorial. In each case, did you know that none of these was the first commemorative to the president that they honor? Let's start with the Washington Monument. The very first, and it's called the Washington Monument, the very first memorial to the first president, George Washington, is in a small state park in Maryland, almost midway between Frederick and Hagerstown. So as you're headed out to the western portion of the state, perhaps stop by Washington Monument State Park, the first completed monument to George Washington. Came about in 1827 on Independence Day. citizens of nearby Boonesboro erected or started to erect this structure using granite right on site, and then they held a brief dedication ceremony, as you can see. Several months later, they finished up the project, so it is in its completed state here, just 30 feet high, 54-foot circumference, just like the monument here in Washington. There are stairs inside, so you can walk up to the top. Not as long a walk, and of course you can't even walk up the real Washington Monument these days. You have to take the elevator. A newspaper account at the time said, "As it was raised in much haste, we cannot boast the regular accuracy of perfect beauty, yet it possesses both solidity and durability, two important qualities. Though rude and naked of all charms of architecture, it has such strength as will preserve it for ages." And indeed, it has lasted. So 1827, that was about 2 decades before work started on the Washington Monument downtown. And then it was a private effort. Funding ran out and it wasn't completed until after the Civil War. It's hard to see from this picture, but you probably know that it has sort of a two-tone appearance. The original quarry where the stone came from was no longer in operation when work resumed on it. So it's a different shade at the top. And for all those visiting tourists who, or even visiting relatives who come to see the well-known monuments, this one included, you can tell them it has that two-tone shade to it because that marks the high water point of the Potomac. That's really not true, of course, and may not be much of a joke, and may even not be a joke at all in the future. But the first memorial to the first president that was in Washington came about even before the monument. It's this statue unveiled in 1840. 8 years earlier, Congress had commissioned a statue on the occasion of the centennial of Washington's birth. It was actually sculpted in Italy and then had to be brought over here. It was then installed in the Capitol Rotunda. And this marvelous book, now out of print, but tells the rest of the story. Turns out the floor of the Capitol and the Rotunda started to sag under the weight of this statue. So Washington was moved to an open area on the east side of the Capitol. That's the photo that you're seeing here. But then public ridicule began, for here was the heroic likeness of the father of the country, bare from the waist up, exposed to the elements. Book goes on, the bitter cold winds and rains swept the open plaza, and in winter, snow clung to Washington's torso and drifted onto his lap. Noting Washington's outstretched sword, one wag said he was sure that Washington was crying, "Take my sword, if you will, but bring me some clothes." And then later it was moved again where it is today to the Smithsonian, the American History Museum, second floor by the escalators there. But you may notice that the base of the statue is no longer with it. There you see just Washington himself. Turns out the base of the statue is somewhere in the heating plant for the U.S. Capitol, just off the Southeast Expressway. And security there is almost as tight as the Capitol itself, so I can't tell you exactly where it is. Similarly, the Jefferson Memorial came about more than 100 years after the first memorial in terms of a statue to Thomas Jefferson. And the statue was given in 1834 as a private gift. It was commissioned by Uriah Levy, the first Jewish Commodore of the U.S. Navy. He served in the War of 1812. He very much admired Jefferson and even purchased Monticello long after Jefferson's death, and it had fallen into disrepair. Monticello, of course, is a marvelous place to visit in central Virginia. But again, from this book, it notes that in the first half of the 19th century, American tolerance for persons of a different race or religion was not high, and a gift from a man named Levy made members of Congress uncomfortable. Within the year, the statue was removed and placed on the north grounds of the White House. And here's a photo of that. The executive branch of government apparently was less squeamish, so the author writes. Well, 40 years later, the heirs of Lieutenant Levy demanded that the gift be formally accepted or returned. Congress then complied, and the splendid statue was then placed in the Capitol Rotunda, where Washington's statue had originally been. Similarly, the Lincoln Memorial, not the first statue of the 16th president, that came about just 3 years after his assassination. And it's in front of what is the DC Court of Appeals today. That building was originally City Hall. And a little trivia fact, that is the third oldest government building in Washington after the White House and the Capitol. The statue was a private initiative by DC residents, many of whom felt remorse over the assassination of Lincoln that of course occurred in their city at Ford's Theater. And in fact, the largest donation for this statue, again, a private effort, came from the manager of Ford's Theater. It was sculpted by an Irish-American artist who had known Lincoln and in fact was at Ford's Theater that fateful night. The dedication ceremony was quite an event. It was attended by the then president, Andrew Johnson, and the future president, the Civil War general, Ulysses S. Grant, and about an estimated 20,000 residents, which amounted to 20% of the city's population. And in fact, this is the oldest extant memorial to Lincoln in all of the U.S. Like Washington, it once stood on a much larger base. There it is in 1919 when it was taken down for renovation of the building and then reinstalled, not on that tall column, but a rectangular base that you see there. There is another, well, many, of course, statue, but one other statue of Abraham Lincoln in Washington that you probably have been reading about. This is actually in Lincoln Park, east of the Capitol. It's called the Emancipation Statue. Today, it is the subject of some controversy because of the kneeling pose of the freed enslaved person there. But interesting to note that it was originally funded largely by DC's Black community as a commemorative to the so-called Great Emancipator. The keynote speaker at that dedication ceremony was none other than Frederick Douglass. And in his marvelous biography of Frederick Douglass, the Yale professor David Blight, the book won a Pulitzer Prize, I believe, he devotes the entire introduction to this book, to the speech that Douglass gave there. Douglass had a complicated relationship with Abraham Lincoln, but in the speech he noted that Lincoln told us he would save the Union with slavery if that's what it took. And Douglass went further to say Lincoln was essentially the white man's president. A full-size statue of Lincoln next to a horse is at Lincoln's Cottage in upper Northwest DC. This is the spot where Lincoln would often ride his horse out to in the morning, spend the day there away from, especially in the summer, away from the heat downtown and the many visitors to the White House. Here's the route that he would take, the White House there at the bottom of the screen. He would it's the actually it's the home of the supervisor of the soldiers' home, still standing in upper Northwest DC. So his route would take him first by Walt Whitman's residence. Walt Whitman was nursing casualties of the Civil War in Washington. This marvelous book about Walt Whitman in Washington. quotes Walt Whitman is noting that Lincoln always has a company of 25 or 30 cavalry with sabers drawn and held upright over their shoulders. They say this guard was against his personal wish, but he lets his counselors have their way. Perhaps because an earlier trip out to the cottage at the soldier's home, there was an assassination attempt, and Lincoln arrived there with a bullet hole through his stovepipe hat. Walt Whitman goes on to comment, I see very clearly Abraham Lincoln's dark brown face with deep cut lines, the eyes, always to me with a deep latent sadness in the expression. We have got so we exchange bows, very cordial ones. Lincoln would then go by a contraband camp. Contraband camps during the Civil War were camps where fleeing enslaved people would often flee near Army outposts for protection of the U.S. Army. It said that Lincoln would sometimes stop here, and some of the may have had an influence on his thinking for what was perhaps his most consequential act during his presidency, issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. One of the early drafts was written at the cottage. Today it's called Lincoln's Cottage on the grounds of the soldier's home. Two statues of Lincoln and Washington are together at the back of the National Cathedral. Quite appropriate because the cathedral has been the site of many presidential funerals. In fact, you might say one president never left. Woodrow Wilson is entombed right off of the nave of the National Cathedral. Woodrow Wilson, also a reminder of Woodrow Wilson in Washington, is the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. It doesn't have a building of its own, so you may not even be aware of it, but it's housed within the Ronald Reagan International Trade Center. Wilson, a Democrat, Ronald Reagan, a Republican, so a bit of bipartisanship, which is certainly needed these days. There is also a statue of Ronald Reagan in the Capitol Rotunda, and a larger than life statue of Reagan at what is now Reagan National Airport. Many of us long timers still refer to it as national, but indeed. And he's standing next to him is his former transportation secretary, Elizabeth Dole. So the statue at the Capitol Rotunda is there with Thomas Jefferson. There are 7 other presidents with statues in the rotunda. That will be sort of the final exam. You can be thinking about that during the rest of the talk. Woodrow Wilson is one of the few presidents who didn't leave Washington after his term. He bought this quite grand house, and it is today the Woodrow Wilson House Museum along S Street, one of the properties of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They often hold tours. And Wilson was the president during Prohibition, but in his he stocked his later home here with a quite large wine cellar that you can also view on the tour. And a current former president who is still living in Washington, perhaps you recognize the home of the Obamas, not too far from the Woodrow Wilson house. The Obamas' home is on Belmont Road, and Woodrow Wilson's house on S Street, both of them just off Mass Avenue near the mosque, near Rock Creek downtown. One president who had to flee the White House while he was living in it was, of course, James Madison during the War of 1812 when the British invaded and burned Washington. And that is why in our county, Montgomery County, little Brookville, Maryland, bills itself as the U.S. capital for a day. James Madison spent one night at this house. It's now called the James Madison House in Brookville, private home. In late August 1814, this quiet town became the scene of frantic activity as citizens of Washington, including Madison and some of his cabinet, arrived here. On August 26th, it was, after being on the run in Northern Virginia for 2 nights, Madison and other cabinet members found refuge in this circa 1798 home of the postmaster of Brookville, Caleb Bentley, living there with his second wife, who was a friend of Dolly Madison. Bentley's first wife was Sarah Brooke, daughter of the town's father. Now, sometimes it's claimed that Madison carried with him a strong box containing the entire U.S. Treasury. That apparently is a myth, but probably the Treasury could be held in a strong box today, since it's mostly IOUs. The house, as I said, it's a private residence today, stands on a side street. If you know Brookville, you head out Georgia Avenue, and then Georgia Avenue takes a sharp turn to the right. Market Street is the road that goes off to the left. It's just a few houses down that road. When Madison returned to Washington, of course, the White House was uninhabitable, so he spent most of the rest of his term at the Octagon House, which is sometimes open for tours, 18th and East Streets Northwest. It's actually owned by the American Institute of Architects, and their headquarters is actually the concrete building that wraps around the back of the Octagon House. Many presidents, of course, lived in Washington before they became presidents, often serving in the cabinet or serving in Congress. I'll mention just one, and in fact, this is James Madison's successor's house. This is James Monroe's house, but today it is the Arts Club of Washington on I Street between 20th and 21st Streets. And I wanted to mention it because they actually have have various events, but they have a weekly concert series at noon on Fridays that you can attend. artsclubofwashington.org. And inside, of course, is a portrait of James Madison. So the big three, as I mentioned earlier, are joined by another big memorial to another president, a later president, FDR. But the original memorial for FDR, much smaller. It's this marble block. Do you know where it is located? It's actually in front of the Archives building, which was built during FDR's term, on the Pennsylvania Avenue side of the Archives building. There it is in the foreground. It simply says, "In memory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt." And in fact, that is all he wanted, as this sign near the spot notes. He actually called in a friend of his, Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. Imagine that, presidents and Supreme Court justices conversing. But anyway, he told Frankfurter, if any memorial is to be erected to me, it should consist of just a stone block. And he put his hand on the desk in the Oval Office, about that size, and placed in front of the Archives building. I don't care what it is made of, whether limestone or granite or whatnot. In fact, it's marble. But I want it plain, without any ornamentation, with just simple carving in memory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But of course, FDR was a much beloved president, and that simply wasn't enough of a memorial. His death early in his fourth term, this newsreel gives a sense of how beloved FDR was.
Aboard a special train beginning the 24-hour trip back to Washington, the 31st President of the United States leaves Warm Springs forever. And all along the 700-mile route, people gather to honor President Roosevelt and his ideals. Slowly the train backs into Union Station in the United States Capitol, awaited by a military guard of honor and members of the late great Chief Executive's family. With Justice Burns and Secretary Wallace, President Harry S. Truman heads the assemblage of the nation's leaders.
So you get a sense of the outpouring of grief, and that shot there of Harry Truman and Henry Wallace together. Of course, Henry Wallace was vice president in FDR's third term, but he was essentially dumped from the ticket. And if he was a very liberal, progressive politician. If he had remained vice president, he would have succeeded FDR. And one of those big what ifs of history. History might have been very different.
6-horse.
So, as I said, the much larger FDR memorial exists today along the tidal basin. It's divided into what are called 4 rooms to symbolize the 4 terms of the president, spread among nearly 8 acres. It's work on it, or design consideration began 1955, but of course this did not open until 1997. Presidential memorials are often quite fraught projects. And in addition to this, after it opened, was a statue of FDR on his wheelchair because of his polio. Didn't want to be seen often with crutches or in the wheelchair. The American Institute of Architects has a wonderful guide to Washington architecture. I'll quote from it in other cases. It calls this statue an obvious afterthought, but does say that though FDR himself opposed a memorial of such scale, his legacy clearly warrants the acreage. And by special dispensation, there is a statue of his wife, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Presidential memorials are supposed to be only to the president himself. FDR also has sort of a fingerprint, you might say, on Bethesda Naval Hospital, further out the Wisconsin Avenue. According to historians, it was Roosevelt who essentially designed the building. Roosevelt rejected the original design for a conventional 5-story hospital building, instead giving architects his own sketch for a 15-story white tower that stands today. According to the National Archives, FDR modeled the building after the state capitol in Lincoln, Nebraska, which he himself had dedicated during a re-election campaign stop in 1936. And FDR picked the very site that it's on today. In July 1938, he was driven in his car to what was then a bucolic setting along Rockville Pike in the then small village of Bethesda, across the road from the then new NIH. The presidential car paused on a grassy knoll west of dense woodlands. FDR reached over the side of his open touring car, touched the ground with his cane, announcing, "We will build the hospital here." And there is his sketch on a White House pad with his initials, FDR, New Naval Hospital, center 15 stories, additions on 2 sides of 2 stories. And there is the Nebraska State Capitol. So you can see he didn't completely plagiarize the design, but similar. Another connection FDR has to the Bethesda Naval Hospital. Of course, that's where presidents have their annual physicals. There's FDR leaving in his open touring car. This is after the dedication of the building, but it was after he had his physical in 1944 at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, according to this book by University of Maryland professor Jay Winnick, that doctors had diagnosed that FDR was suffering from end-stage congestive heart failure and other maladies, and they predicted that he had no more than a year to live. This was March 1944. We don't know if the doctors actually told FDR the prognosis, but in November 44, he did run for his 4th term, perhaps knowing that he was likely unable to serve out the full term. The official memorial to President Kennedy is the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. And President Kennedy, of course, is buried at Arlington National Cemetery under the eternal flame. There is one other president who is buried at Arlington. You can be thinking about that as well. A very different sort of reminder of President Kennedy is Martin's Tavern in Georgetown. And perhaps you can reserve the proposal booth. And that is where JFK proposed to Jackie. Jackie and JFK have a lot of history in Georgetown, and the American Institute of Architects DC chapter offers this map, self-guided tour, if you're interested, on their website. Speaking of first ladies, did you know that Lady Bird Johnson has her own national park right here in DC? A small park. You may notice this sign on your way to Reagan National Airport. And within this park, there is a nod to her husband. There's the Lyndon Baines Johnson Memorial Grove within the park. This book notes that President Johnson began using this island paradise, as remembered, Reagan National is on an island, began using this island paradise as a getaway to decompress from the pressures of office. Now a grove of white pine trees, a meadow, and a 19-foot high granite monolith quarried near his Texas ranch serve as a living memorial to our 36th president. A number of 20th century presidents, Johnson included, have buildings in DC named for them. If we're in person, this could be something of a quiz. We've mentioned one, the Ronald Reagan International Trade Center. This is, of course, the Executive Office Building right next to the Oval Office of the White House. It's named for a president. It's the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. When built in 1871, took many years through 1888, it was purported to be the largest office building in the world. Now the Pentagon is reported to be that. And again, from the AIA guide, a bit about this building. It's Second Empire style, as I said, took actually 17 years to build. When finally finished, it was widely reviled as a symbol of Gilded Age excess. Its ornate style had fallen out of fashion, and the building's great cost, more than $10 million, doesn't seem like great cost, but an enormous sum in those days, and it was considered a scandalous amount of money. The building was repeatedly threatened with radical revisions that almost seemed punitive in spirit. In 1917, the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts asked John Russell Pope, a noted architect, to cloak the hulking structure in more orthodox classical garb. And in 1929, after President Hoover groaned about the, quote, architectural orgy that loomed over the White House, another architect was given a similar assignment. In 1957, a presidential commission recommended total demolition, but it was not until the 1960s that general opinions of the building began to soften. And thank goodness, because it is gorgeous inside. I'd never been in the building up until just a few months ago, had the opportunity to be inside. And there's a look inside at one of the former library inside the building. This rather nondescript building is named for a former president. It's at 3rd and D Street Southwest, right at the base of Capitol Hill. That's a hint. This is the Gerald Ford House Office Building. Most people think of the three more ornate house office buildings on the House side, actually up on Capitol Hill, but of course more space was needed, and so this building was added to the Capitol Hill complex, so at the base of the hill. The Commerce Department building is named for a president. It's actually the Herbert Hoover Commerce Department building, named for the president who, well, was unable to deal with the Depression. The Environmental Protection Agency building is named for a president. The building itself is named for the president. It's not that the Environmental Protection Agency is named for the president. Turns out this is the William Jefferson Clinton Federal Building. The Department of State building is formally named for a president as well. One we've mentioned, it's the Harry S. Truman Department of State building. Somewhat ironic. The headquarters of for diplomats, named for the president who dropped the atomic bomb. And this building, also named for a president, building's probably not well known unless you worked for the federal government, is the Office of Personnel Management, and it is the Theodore Roosevelt building. The CIA building is named for a president, probably well known, George Bush. But which Bush? The one you might say with greater intelligence experience. George H.W. Bush was once director of Central Intelligence. The Education Department building is formally named for a president. It is the Lyndon Baines Johnson Department of Education building. And the connection there is a solid one. Here's LBJ signing the very first federal piece of legislation having to do with education. Education traditionally considered a local responsibility. He is signing this bill next to the one-room schoolhouse that he attended. It's now on part of his ranch, presidential site in Texas. And sitting next to him is his former teacher in this one-room schoolhouse. A presidential memorial almost blocks out the Education Department building today. This is the Eisenhower Memorial. And again, this is one of those memorials that took many years to come about, quite a bit of controversy connected with it. So Eisenhower has both a memorial and a building. Theodore Roosevelt has both a memorial and a building. I showed you the building. This is his memorial. Of course, it's on, it's larger than life statue. It's on Roosevelt Island. So it's an island. Not, you might say, not many people go there, but he does get visitors. Thomas Jefferson has his memorial and a building as well. This is the Thomas Jefferson Library of Congress building, the main building of the Library of Congress. Again, a connection because after the War of 1812, Thomas Jefferson sold his personal library to restore the Library of Congress, which also was totally destroyed when the Capitol was burned by the British. The Library of Congress then located within a part of the Capitol. And this building, I think, has one of the most gorgeous interior spaces in all of Washington. This is the main reading room, several stories high. You may have read that there's a proposal to do some renovation of this, and there's some concern that this gorgeous room may not look quite as gorgeous afterwards. The Library of Congress actually has 3 buildings today, right together there on Capitol Hill, off behind it, and then off to the side. The one behind it is the John Adams building, and the one off to the side is the James Madison building. Technically, it's the James Madison Memorial Building. It is the official memorial to James Madison, and there's a statue of James Madison in the lobby. The John Adams building, look carefully, this is just the John Adams building as opposed to the James Madison Memorial Building. As presidential historian David McCullough notes, John Adams, the second president and a founding father, is the only one of the presidential founding fathers who does not have an official memorial. He calls it a glaring omission. There is a private foundation working to bring about a memorial both to John Adams and his son, also President John Quincy Adams. The effort got underway in the early 2000s. It has not produced a memorial at this point, and the legislation has been extended several times. Currently, the foundation is due to go out of existence December 2025, so the clock is ticking. There is this marker in the Capitol. It's in Statuary Hall, where the House of Representatives used to meet, marking the very spot where John Quincy Adams' desk was. John Quincy Adams was one of the, perhaps only, president after his term as president who was then elected to Congress. Usually it's the other way around, and served many years as in Congress. But this spot is marked because while serving in Congress later in life, he actually suffered a stroke while sitting at his desk here. And he was in a coma for 2 days in the Capitol and then died. You may know Adams Mill Road in DC. That is indeed a reminder of John Quincy Adams. It goes to Adams Mill along Rock Creek. Adams purchased the mill 1823, just 1 year before he became president. And he didn't divest himself of his business. Sound familiar? It turns out John Quincy Adams was burdened by the mill's unstable operating from all the way through till the end of his life. That's because Rock Creek, either flooding or practically a trickle, the water flow of Rock Creek was affected by weather and seasonal changes. And so of course, the mill depends on water power to turn the mill wheels. And so the mills had a checkered and ultimately unsuccessful history. And Adams Morgan, the neighborhood in DC, is indeed named in a way for John Quincy Adams. It's a combination of the John Quincy Adams School and another school no longer standing. Goes back to the days of school segregation in the District of Columbia. And so the neighborhood was a hyphenated version of the two schools, one, the Adams School for white children, and the Thomas P. Morgan Elementary School for Black children. Cleveland Park, nearer to Chevy Chase, is indeed named for Grover Cleveland. He had a summer home in Cleveland Park. It was variously called Red Top for the red roof, or Oak Hill, set up on the hill. Bought in 1886 during his first term as president, used it as his summer home, again, much like Lincoln, to get away from the heat of downtown. Another president who remained in Washington after his term in a different capacity, William Howard Taft. He was later named Chief Justice. And so a bust of him, along with all the Chief Justices, is in the Supreme Court building. And in fact, William Howard Taft is the other president who is buried in Arlington Cemetery. There is his grave marker, and there is the eternal flame under which John F. Kennedy is buried. There is this statue, not terribly well known. Maybe you can't even identify who president it is to honor. This is the Grant statue right at the base of the Capitol. And in fact, this was the largest equestrian statue memorial when constructed. Stretches out on two sides with scenes of the Civil War to commemorate Grant's time as the winning Union general. Grant was quite an important president, and for his funeral in 1885, his procession surpassed any public demonstration in the country up until that time, with an attendance of 1.5 million people, and additional ceremonies were held elsewhere around the country. His reputation has suffered after his presidency and into the 20th century. Um, uh, Charges of corruption by some cabinet members, mostly did not touch the president himself. But a reevaluation of sorts has been going on by historians, noting that he was, in fact, a strong supporter of the newly freed, emancipated persons. But it was his successor, Rutherford B. Hayes, who removed the troops from the federal troops still in the South after the Civil War to guarantee the new constitutional protections for the newly freed. And with the removal of the troops, paved the way for Jim Crow and the domestic terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan. Also related to the Civil War, there is this memorial to William McKinley. This is, again, is in our home state of Maryland, further out than the Washington Monument. This is on the grounds of the Antietam battlefield in Washington County. McKinley served in the Union Army on the afternoon of the Battle of Antietam, which in fact was the bloodiest day in American history, war casualties, September 17th, 1862. Personally and without orders, served hot coffee and warm food to every man in the regiment on this spot, and in doing so had to pass under fire. There is from the carving at the base of the statue, McKinley giving out coffee. Back in Washington, there is a statue, again, near the Grant statue, but off to the side, of James Garfield, later U.S. president after the Civil War. Garfield also served in the Civil War, but he was assassinated at the train station, which was then located on the mall quite nearby. The second presidential assassination, just 16 years after Lincoln's assassination. Quite a traumatic time for the country. There's a marvelous book about Garfield's assassination and the efforts that doctors did to save him. Medicine not terribly advanced. He probably would have been survived today, but they were unable to locate the bullet lodged in his spine, which is actually housed here in Montgomery County. It's part of the collection at the National Museum of Health and Medicine, a little north of Silver Spring. A national museum used to be on the mall. It's not part of the Smithsonian, started by the U.S. Army during the Civil War. Unclaimed bodies were sent to Washington for autopsies to try to advance medicine. So there are many body parts in this museum, but a very significant site because of another exhibit. It's described as a little black mass, no bigger than the end of my finger, dull, motionless, and harmless, yet the cause of such mighty changes in the world's history as we may perhaps never realize. Who's being quoted is a doctor, and it's one of those big what ifs of history, because this is the doctor who treated Abraham Lincoln after he was assassinated. And what's on display is indeed the bullet that took Abraham Lincoln's life in the National Museum of Health and Medicine on Linden Avenue, just off Georgia Avenue, north of Silver Spring. There are also the doctor's shirt sleeves with Lincoln's blood and fragments of his skull, but we'll move on from that. Lincoln, more happy connection is to New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, a bit larger than what the church that Lincoln would often attend, a few blocks from the White House, with the remodeling and enlargement of the church, new pews, but the original Lincoln pew is there inside. And the church also has a Lincoln room in which they have an early draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. And outside is the hitching post that Lincoln sometimes used. Another church connected with two presidents is National City Christian Church on Thomas Circle. Two stained glass windows, one for James Garfield. National City Christian Church is a church of Disciples of Christ denomination, and James Garfield was a lay minister in that denomination, attended the church, as did Lyndon Johnson, so two stained glass windows to them. But a semi-official church of the presidents is St. John's Episcopal, just beyond Lafayette Square, very near the White House. You can see from this depiction, 1816, the year the church was built. There's the White House in the background, still scarred from the War of 1812. There is a president's pew in the church right up front, beginning with James Madison. Every president has been an occasional attendee. A devoted attendee was Abraham Lincoln, who often came there for evening prayer during weekdays, sat in a rear pew rather than the official pew. It was President John Tyler who paid for the president's pew to be used in perpetuity by the presidents. And Chester A. Arthur commissioned a mural window for his wife, who died a year before he became president. The window is in the church's south transept, visible from the White House. There is the stained glass window to Ellen Lewis Herndon Arthur. And you may remember one president used the church in a little different way. St. Matthew's Cathedral, connected to at least two presidents. President Biden held his pre-inaugural service there. Perhaps more importantly, it was the site of President Kennedy's funeral. And you may remember this very poignant picture from the funeral of little John Kennedy saluting the casket. Another church connected to two presidents, National Presbyterian, not too far from American University, along Nebraska Avenue, mostly connected to President Eisenhower. And the chapel inside this building is dedicated to President Eisenhower. Ronald Reagan also occasionally attended, and so there's a display of hymnals embossed with both presidents' names. Eisenhower did not attend that particular church. It was a later church built after Eisenhower's term. He would have attended this earlier version of the church when it was just south of DuPont Circle. Some of you may remember this very gorgeous Romanesque building. And there is President Eisenhower leaving a service in 1957, stepping down on the steps in front of him and First Lady Mamie Eisenhower, a young woman. Perhaps that's a matter of protocol, because that is a very young Queen Elizabeth when she visited, and on the far right there is Prince Philip. This church was demolished. The church then moved to its current building, and it became something of a cause for preservationists, and helped to the demolition of this church helped to launch the preservation movement in the District of Columbia. So I'll finish up with some recent presidents. I've mentioned everybody but the two in red there, George Bush, Bush II, and Jimmy Carter. I don't know of any lasting reminder of George W. Bush in Washington. Jimmy Carter, no official memorial. The best I could come up with was Stevens School downtown. That's because that's where Amy Carter attended school when her father was in the White House. There's Rosalind Carter bringing young Amy on the first day of school. This school was recently renovated, and it's actually the oldest school building still in use in the District of Columbia. Began as a black school back in the days of segregation, named for the abolitionist Thaddeus Stevens. And I also didn't mention Richard Nixon. Will there be a memorial to the only president who resigned? Well, there is a bust of Richard Nixon. It's right outside the Senate chambers, because there are busts of every vice president who also, Vice President, of course, serves as President of the Senate. The Senate website notes that the sculpture collection celebrates the great figures of our national history. So all vice presidents are there. That would include our very own former governor, Spiro Agnew, who also resigned in disgrace. Perhaps the least likely presidential memorial is this one in Meridian Hill Park to James Buchanan. The story is told by presidential historian Richard Norton Smith. Begins with the song "Listen to the Mockingbird," and he will explain the connection.
The name Harriet Lane may be largely forgotten today, but in the years just before the Civil War, she was almost as famous as her uncle, the President of the United States. Because James Buchanan was a bachelor, Harriet served as his White House hostess. It was Harriet who welcomed the Prince of Wales in 1859, Harriet to whom the song "Listen to the Mockingbird" was dedicated, and Harriet who left funds in her will to erect this monument in Washington's Meridian Hill Park. Even then, there was no rush to memorialize a deeply unpopular president. Another dozen years went by until this 8-foot-tall bronze likeness of Buchanan was unveiled in 1930. Ironically, few presidents have entered office with more impressive credentials, as illustrated by the granite figures sharing space with a somber-looking chief executive. Law recognizes Buchanan's early career in the courtroom and a temperament more suited to the bench than the political arena. Diplomacy pays tribute to his service as James K. Polk Secretary of State and as U.S. Minister to the Court of St. James and Tsarist Russia. Ironically, Buchanan's gifts of conciliation seemed to desert him in the White House. By encouraging pro-slavery forces in Kansas, he inadvertently split his own party right down the middle. Following the election of Abraham Lincoln, Buchanan looked on helplessly as several southern states left the Union. Although he opposed secession, his narrow reading of the Constitution persuaded Buchanan that the federal government had no right to prevent it by force. All of which helps to explain why there was no statue of our 15th president in the nation's capital until a devoted niece willed it almost a century after his presidency.
And you just never know where the presidents will turn up. There's this mural on the side of Mama Aisha's restaurant, very near the Calvert Street Bridge. All the presidents from Eisenhower through Obama. They were asked if President Trump would be added. They said they didn't have the funding to do it, and so apparently it just ends with this segment of the presidents. Of course, more formal portraits of all the presidents can be found at the National Portrait Gallery. And returning there after a 7-city tour now, President Obama is back. Elsewhere is Michelle Obama. Not a portrait, but a photograph, for at least the time being, of President Obama's successor. An artist has not been chosen, at least as far as I know. Tough job, don't you think, painting Donald Trump? Maybe the best way to do it is to an abstract, perhaps, as was done for Bill Clinton. And just beginning last Friday, on display through 2027, is this life-size portrait of Abraham Lincoln. So the final exam, remember, Jefferson and Reagan are two presidents in the rotunda. Yes, president we probably mentioned the most is there, Abraham Lincoln, and a different statue, lighter in weight than the original one, George Washington, James Garfield, Ulysses Grant, Eisenhower, Gerald Ford, not one of the more memorable presidents, but of course he was a longtime congressman and a Republican leader. And the last president one I didn't mention at all, do you recognize? Andrew Jackson. It's almost Batman-esque there, but of course, Jackson has a statue in Lafayette Square right opposite the White House. And that's it. Thank you for spending part of your afternoon speaking here on behalf of Montgomery History, the Historical Society for Montgomery County. And if you are a local history buff, usually on Tuesday afternoons by Zoom, the organization has a weekly presentation, different aspects of local history. You can go to montgomeryhistory.org, get on their email list, just one email newsletter a week announcing what the topic will be. And so I will stop share.
Okay.
Over, sorry, if you need to leave, by all means, that's the beauty of Zoom, you can sneak out.
I don't see any questions on chat, but we're running, we're pretty much beyond our time, but I'll take a question from Chris Palmer.
Hi, Ralph, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Two quick points. One is I was so disappointed there wasn't more about, there weren't more memorials about Jimmy Carter. He seems to me to be a very underestimated president. And the other point I wanted to make was that you made you told me something I did not know, which was that in March 44, FDR's doctors knew that he had less than a year to live from congestive heart failure. And you said, I think you didn't know whether the doctors told him or not, but he ran anyway for a fourth term in November. And of course, we know he died in April of 1945. That was kind of shocking to me. Anything else? Anything you want to add to that?
I don't think I can. The best source would probably be the book that I quoted, Jay Winnick, professor at University of Maryland, and a marvelous question coming from a former professor himself. I've introduced myself to you before because I'm a AU graduate myself of the School of Communications, where Chris was a longtime professor.
Right. Thank you.
Well, to take just one more. Okay. Connie Morella.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Ralph, I think you're terrific. I love the presentation. I just wanted to mention, there is a statue of John Quincy Adams in a room that is right off of the statuary hall. It used to be the speaker's room. It then became the congresswoman's room. And that's when I was in Congress. And there was a big statue of John Quincy Adams. And we rededicated that room to Lindy Boggs. And I will never forget when Lindy gave her speech after we had passed the naming. She said, well, John, I'm sure that your mother, Abigail, would be very pleased to know that you are here in this room surrounded by strong women. So
thank you.
I can arrange for you to go see it if you would like.
That's a marvelous addition. Thank you. Thank you for that bit of inside information. And wonderful to see you, Congresswoman.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. It's great to see you looking so well, and we're always honored to have the former Congresswoman from our very own neighborhood. Okay, everyone. Thank you, Ralph. That was as always. I learned more stuff from you, and I want to thank you again for not just this talk, but for the service you provide to the county in general. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And I should have mentioned, I do have a list of the main spots that I mentioned, so I will email that to the office, and if you could email it out to participants, that would be marvelous.
That'd be great.
Happy to.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.